Hello, I am Emilio Sosa, and this is my life in the theater. I always say that theater chose me. I didn't choose it. Growing up, I grew up here in New York, and I was an artist from a very, very young age. So I knew I was going to have a career in the arts. I had no idea what it would be or how it would manifest. But at a young age, around 13, I just fell in love with fashion. My teenage years, high school, and even college, fashion design was what I was pursuing. It wasn't until I got to college, a teacher at one of our classes made an announcement. Was anyone interested in a summer job? My best friend and I were both interested, but I chose to design children's clothes, and he took a job at Grace Costumes. He told me, Emilio, you have to meet these ladies. They're gonna love you and you're gonna love them. I went in, didn't know a thing about theater. I needed a job, and like he said, I fell in love with the people, and they welcomed me into their family, and that's how I began my theater career. I was 20, it was 1987, a year before I turned 21. Like I said, I had no theater experience, had just seen my first musical through class, and that was a chorus line. So technically I began as a shopper, which for those who don't know what a shopper does, a shopper is the person who literally shops. You buy thread, fabric, notions, whatever was needed to be able to make the costume. I was there for a little bit, then another amazing friend and costume designer, Tony Leslie James, was working with the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. She was designing a ballet for them that I was project managing at Grace Costumes. The wardrobe supervisor decided to pursue another career, and the assistant was promoted, and they asked me through Tony, would I be interested in becoming the assistant costume supervisor. One of the most valuable lessons that I learned early in my career while I was touring with the Ailey Company was the maintenance and durability of costumes. Topdog, Underdog. My first play, because this was 2002 Broadway, 2001 at the Public. And this came about, once again, is through dance. I had designed a dress for a dear friend and dancer, Sarita Allen. She was dancing at a benefit for complexion dance, and she asked me to design a dress for that benefit. There are two people that I wanted to meet. Patrick Swayze, who was the host, and George C. Wolfe was there. And at the time, George was still running the Public Theater. I just went up to him and I was like, Mr. Wolfe, I am the best costume designer that you have yet to work with. And anyone who knows George C. Wolfe, that his ears just went bing! He was like, sure, young man, send me your things. You know, at that time, I don't know what things was. I really didn't have a resume or portfolio or anything together, because like I said, it was early in my career. And just by chance, just by the universe, I was featured in Vibe magazine in the early 2000s with a really hip, young music magazine. So I got all my stuff together, I sent it in to the Public Theater. The assistant, Irene Cabrera, was reading the Vibe magazine when my photo appeared, and then the package was on her desk. And she opened the package and she said, she told George, you have to meet this guy, you have to bring him in. And they called me up. I had a 3-hour meeting. He offered me Topdog and Underdog as costume designer. Project Runway came about out of sheer necessity. I had been on the road with Celine Dion on her world tour. That's 2008 through 2009. I had gotten back to the States. Our last stop was Monte Carlo. We were in Monaco. So I came back, it was March of 2009, and I was in Rochester, New York, doing a production of, I think it was Fences, or The Piano Lesson, one of those. And I was in this like questionable hotel, we'll call it a hotel, and I just sat there and I was like, oh my God, this is what my career has become. I just came off of like the most amazing world tour where we visited the most amazing venue, and now I'm in Rochester. And then I received an email from a friend who was in LA, who was married to a producer. And she was like, Project Runway is looking for designers. And I said, sure, I'm not knocking Rochester. I said, it couldn't get any worse than what it is right now. I filmed that season that summer. That was 2009. That's how Project Runway came about. I did very well, actually. I was runner-up, so I'm excited. And because of me, I think, is when you really started seeing costume designers as a person. Because all those shows are casted. You have the young one, you have the older costume designer, so it was after my season then, and they always had someone that designed costumes. Maureen, Marsha. It's a red dress benefit for heart disease, and everyone wears a red dress, but Maureen wanted to wear a suit. So it was great to be able to design this for her. And also, I kind of grew up with the Brady Bunch, so it was super, super cool. And she was so sweet. Even after we did this, we kept in touch a little bit. But that was a great moment for me, growing up in the 70s, and you get to dress, Marsha. So I kind of made it in a weird way. So Project Runway was very special. Porgy and Bess was also another great experience. I'm looking at Audra and Norm, who have become great friends. But that began through my association with Diane Paulus at ART. But I had met Diane about 4 or 5 years prior. We worked together at Bay Street Theater out in Sag Harbor. It brings me back. That was my second Broadway show after Topdog. So it was 10 years. There was a 10-year gap that I wasn't on Broadway. And in that 10-year gap, I was regional. I designed anywhere, anytime anyone asked me to do anything, I was. So I was at La Jolla, I was at the Geffen, the Kirk Douglas, the Alliance in Atlanta, the Goodman in Chicago. I was in Dallas, Miami. So I really learned what the industry was, because when I did Topdog and it was so well received, after that it was like crickets. I hadn't really developed relationships with anyone in the industry, because George just plucked me out of, like I said, the music and dance world. And I realized now, these many X years later, is that this entire business is about relationships. And here's Audra again in Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill. Once again, got a phone call from the producers, the amazing Jeffrey Richards. He asked me, would I be interested in working with him on this show with Audra? Anything that says Audra McDonald, that's an automatic yes. I don't even know what it was. I mean, I knew she was playing Billie Holiday. There was one dress and a rhythm section. I built a bond with Audra, and now Will Swinton, her husband, who's in the Neil Diamond Show, which I also designed. Like I said, we're all one big happy family. There's no smoke and mirrors. There's only like 3 of us on Broadway. She really, really transformed herself into Billie Holiday. This is how method actor she is. This is why she's so amazing. She found out what perfume she wore. We shared that Billie Holiday wore wedges, not heels. When she does a deep dive, and I think for me in my department, costumes, it made us better. It made us authentic. Because when she started singing and she was in that role, you thought you were watching Billie Holiday perform at her peak. Get on your feet. The story of Emilio and Gloria Estefan. What's interesting about this show is that I heard about the show a year before I got the gig through the grapevine. And I had my assistant, the great Rita Wu, I said, let's find Emilio Estefan's information in Miami, and let's call him and let's send him my packet. And we did that, and we got all the way to a phone call with, I think, his assistant. And she was very, very nice. She said, Emilio looked at your work, is very impressive, but the decision goes to the director, Jerry Mitchell, at that time. And I think another designer was up for it or got it and something happened. which is what happens in this business, you know. I'm not mad at that. I'm just glad I was number 2 on the list. And they called me. I met with Jerry. We had a great meeting. And then I had a meeting with Emilio and Gloria. And once again, I grew up on her music. I told her I remember as a college kid dancing on a speaker, half naked at Palladium to conga, a big music. So I had a connection to the music at that end. So that was very special. And it was great because I'm Latino. So my mom was able to come and enjoy the show. So great people, Estefan. And Jerry Mitchell became a great supporter of my work. And like I said, he's a genius. Motown, when I say I really grew up on Motown, I really did, because I remember when we first came to the States, my brothers and I, we were really young. So it was the late 60s. And my older cousin had a lot of these Motown records and with a little star on Detroit. And I used to think, what is Detroit? At that time I was like 4 or 5, I didn't know what it was. So that's how long Motown had been in my world. And getting this one, once again, yeah, I had to audition. People just don't call me and say you got the job. You still have to audition and show up. They looked at everyone. I think every costume designer was asked to come in and present. And when I went in to see Mr. Gordy, what I wanted to differentiate myself from every other costume designer. And the fact that I had a fashion background was to my advantage, because I was able to really speak upon Motown's influence, not just as a music genre, but as a fashion movement. It was pre-Civil Rights Movement when he started Motown, 1959. And the Civil Rights Act didn't come into 1964. But he was presenting us as people, and that's something that hadn't happened before. And that's what I wanted him to hear from me. I think at a point I stopped just trying to get the job, but wanted to make sure that he understood that his legacy encompassed more than just music. It was about how we, people of color, were looked at in the world. And I think that resonated with him. And he said, "You're the guy we want." And that's how I got to do Motown the Musical. I think Motown transcends more than just music. It was a cultural revolution. Fucking A, can you say that? Oh, bleep, bleep A. Susan Laurie Parks. My connection with Susan Laurie Parks, Topdog, Underdog. She wrote the first play I ever designed. So I'm always in the back of her head. I just designed The Harder They Come for her, downtown at the Public. And that's 22 years later. So when I ever look at anything that Susan Laurie written or produced, I think of loyalty, because that's 22 years. And I've watched her career ascend, and she's always thought of me for her work. So it's humbling, but it's about loyalty, and that's super, super special. It's funny, I just met another young lady from this show. We were in Atlanta, and she said, "I worked on Eve's song, do you remember me?" I'm like, "Yes." I did Eve's songs through my great friend, the director Joe Bonney. Once again, it's about the relationships you build. I met Joe Bonney, was the second director to ever hire me, second to George. Because like I said, during that time when it was cricket time, I call that my cricket time. During my cricket time, Joe Bonney was the director who called me and took me out to La Jolla Playhouse. Once again, when Joe calls, I'm like, yes, and then I figure out how to do it. So it had all the ingredients of my life. People who had supported me, a place that I've worked a lot. So just love. I look at it and I just think of great people. The light. When I think of MCC, it's always about going somewhere where I haven't been. And I remember Vaughn was our director, and she was super sweet and wanted to work with me, and she asked me would I do the show with her, and I did it. The Hot Wing King, that was written by Katori Hall, and what I loved about this play is it was about gay men of color and the different layers that make us who we are. Whether you are more comfortable with your flamboyancy or you're more comfortable in your masculinity, this play just showed us the entire spectrum. She told us that this play was inspired by her uncle and his partner. So she had live, one-to-one experience with that subject. And you could tell in the writing, because like I said, we're not all the same. We all express our queerness differently. And for me, it was important the way that, how she was able to portray, for me, how realistic it was. And Katori Hall, she's a genius. So whenever genius calls, I usually answer the phone. 72 miles to go. It was about non-documented immigrants who have a son, a dreamer, who was brought to this country without his, he was a child. And when he found out that he couldn't join the armed forces because of that, that really kind of like broke him. So I think of that, but I think of COVID, because it was cut short, and that time period was so difficult for so many of us on so many levels, but art goes on and art is healing. So I'm glad, once again, Joe Bonnie, Joe Bonnie calls, I'm there. Trouble in Mind, Charles Randolph Wright from Motown. You see how it all piggybacks? So Charles Randolph Wright, his return to Broadway, he was like, I have this amazing play by Alice Childress. It was her first Broadway debut at 70, because this play originally was supposed to premiere in 1955, if I'm not mistaken. But the ending and the subject matter was not deemed appropriate for the audiences of that day, because she really, really dealt with the inequity and the racism within the theater community, and they were not ready for it. So the producers asked her to change a couple of things in her story, and she said no. And it was not produced on Broadway until we did it in 2021. So when we did it with La Chance, it was amazing. The 40s and 50s is my pocket. I don't know why. I have an affinity for it. Suits and dresses. I do a lot of different things, but that's like my pocket, I always call it. And then I received a Tony nomination for it. So it just layer on top of layer on top of layer. Ain't No Mo. Super ambitious. Telling the truth. No holds barred. All that wrapped into that amazing, amazing show. So it's very special, and like I said, the fact that it only lasted the amount of time that it did brought so much attention to the disparity of what gets produced and who sees what is valued. And I think the fact that Ain't No Mo is still now getting recognized, which is great. And we did this show in November, December, means that it touched people. 1776. I saw the most amazing video that Diane Paulus just sent me. It's two young girls dressed in our costumes performing the opening sequence. If you haven't watched the show, at the beginning there's a sequence when the actors they transform from modern dress into period dress through adding a period coat, and then pulling up their white, everyone had black pants and white socks. So when they pulled up their socks over their pant, it gave the impression that they were wearing knickers like the period and their black shoes. And these two little girls did everything from that opening. And it was mind blowing, and I texted Diane back like, I'm crying in tears. Because, I think us theater folk, we can get in our own bubble. Those are theater goers in the future. Those are theater makers of the future. And we have to expose our young people to the theater a lot earlier if we want them to be the audiences we're looking for. Skeleton Crew. Amazing. Amazing director, Ruben Santiago Hudson, who I've known personally but never worked with. But I'm always like, Ruben, when are we going to work together? We will. Finally, he found one, Skeleton Crew, which was written by Dominique Morisseau. And it had in it one of my dear special friends, Miss Felicia Rashad. You know, it was taking her out of her element. She was in like overalls and sweatshirts and boots, which for a lot of people, they hadn't really seen her that way. It's a 4-person show, and I designed the show 4 times during its run. Because after the first week of tech, one of our male leads went down. So then we had to put in the understudy. So he had to learn everything. So it's like rehearsal again. So we get through him. Next week, the young lady of the show, she went down. So we put in her understudy. Now when the understudy goes in, we know what we want, but she was different body type, so I had to redesign it again. So then third, our second gentleman left, and then lastly, our lead went out. So we did it 4 times. I think the original cast really, did the show together, like for 2 weeks. Sweeney Todd. Funny, I knew nothing of this show except the title, that Patti LuPone had done it, and it's about a barber and meat pies. When Tommy called that he was interested in meeting with me on this, I was like, first of all, it's Tommy Kail. I'm like, he even knows who I am? I was like, yeah. So, super cool. They're super cool. And we talked about like my journey and just getting to know each other. Then after like maybe an hour, he was like, okay, I have this show I want to talk to you about. And he said that he and Josh were doing Sweeney, and they wanted to invite me to do the costumes. You could have knocked me over with a feather. All these great names, you know? And Emilio. So what I did, which drove my associate designer crazy, was I played the soundtrack 3 times, back to back. That's 9 hours. By the 9 hours, she was like, I'm not ever speaking to you again. But we had drawn out the entire show. I was nervous as a wreck because, you know, it's a cast of 26, and I was missing maybe like 3 or 4 pieces out of like maybe 200 pieces. And those 3 pieces looked like Mount Everest to me. Like, oh my God, I'm never gonna get a job again. He's gonna hate me. How could I fail like this? So right before we start, I go over to him and say, Tommy, I just wanna let you know. He could sense the nervousness in me. So he just not even thinking, just puts his hand on my back. And I just exhaled. He says, it's okay. Whatever we don't get to today, we'll get to tomorrow. It's gonna be okay. And after that, it was just like, it was okay. I told him these are the pieces that are not gonna be here today, but we're working super hard to get them here tomorrow or the next day. He says, don't worry, it's gonna be okay. Let's just start at the top. And I think we produced a beautiful show that I'm super, super proud. And for that, Sweeney Todd will go down for me as one of top 2 theater experiences. And I'm so happy that it's happened so later in my career, because now I have it to compare it to. Neil Diamond. I love this show. I love all my shows. The Neil Diamond story came about during COVID when we were all home. I got a call from Michael Mayer, the director. We had worked on a show. Sherry Renee Scott co-wrote it with Dick Scanlon, and Dick Scanlon and Michael Mayer directed at Second Stage. So I knew Michael in passing. I seen him in the street. Hey, Michael, yeah, sure, we're gonna work together. You know, he called me during COVID. It was like July. He was like, I have a show that I want to bring you on, and the reason I'm bringing you on is because you have experience doing big shows. You know, by that time I had Motown, On Your Feet, The Rockettes, and I love big shows for some reason. There's so much to keep. There's so many like balls in the air, but that's how my brain works. He said, I have a show and I want to bring you along. And then I'm like, sure, it's COVID, no one's working, yes. He said, I'm gonna direct the Neil Diamond musical called Beautiful Noise. But it is not going to be structured like your traditional jukebox musical. But even going even further back, my connection to Neil Diamond is twofold. I used to love to work to Light FM here in New York. That's soft rock. What I would listen to while I was in college, drafting patterns. I would be up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning with Light FM in the background, and they always played Neil Diamond. So for me, when I hear that music, it takes me to that wonderful place when I was a young kid, just like sewing fashion, and it was all we talked about was clothing and what we were gonna do. It was much simpler then, and Neil Diamond was like my soundtrack. And then when I started doing my research on Neil's clothing, I learned that his costume designer, Bill Frank Whiten, was a man of color in the 70s. He designed all of Neil's stage clothing. And Neil is a peacock. Neil wore sequins, shoulder pads, like fringe. He did everything. Neil was not afraid of anything that was shiny. So when I learned that, it gave it another layer. I don't think very few people know this man's name. That's why I always bring it up. He designed for the Jackson 5, the Commodores, Earth, Wind and Fire. And when you think of these supergroups, it wasn't just like shiny shirt, shiny pants. He was creating like stories through his costumes. And now here I am, man of color. It's like full circle. I was able to say that to Neil himself. That thank you for what you've done to elevate men of color's work. Because you did it early and you're doing it now. So Neil Diamond is college. It's the soundtrack, young, fashion, and then now it's like, now that I know what he's done, it's like Broadway, it's representation, is not being afraid to be different. It's about doing things your way. I have the most amazing team of people who support my work and are the most talented people that work today. It's Emilio Sosa on the title, but there's a lot of people who are lifting me up, and that's how I did it. I was able to rely on their talents to keep it going while I came back. Just keep it going, I'll be back. Also, my costume shop experience taught me how to get stuff through a costume shop. I know how to edit myself to where the design doesn't suffer. And it was a great team. It was a hell of a season. It was a whirlwind. It wasn't planned, it happened. And the variety, from Ain't No Mo to Goodnight Oscar in the same theater. Yeah, Ain't No Mo and Goodnight Oscar are both of the Belasco. So, interesting. And that's the end of my career. For now.